In order to learn about credit card APRs, we have to go back, way back to a time before you were probably even born. Well, I'm pretty sure you weren't born unless you're like several hundred years old. This is because credit card interest rates have a pretty interesting history behind them. What I'm about to share with you will be kind of hard to believe, so you may want to brace yourselves. Believe it or not, credit cards weren't always a hugely profitable product for banks. In today's world, when we take a look at all of the sign-up bonus offers, the reward structures of credit cards, 0% APR offers, credits that are akin to coupons, and the additional benefits and features, it seems to be unbelievable that some banks found themselves in a little financial trouble with their credit card business. By the way, there's a little bit of irony here, the fact that banks got themselves in financial trouble with credit cards, but now that is being shifted onto the consumer who can find themselves in trouble if they don't understand the game. Okay, I'm getting a little off topic here, so I'll get back to what I was talking about. In fact, there was a very prominent bank that's still around today that was hemorrhaging money because of the cost of loaning funds, including funds borrowed through credit card transactions. You see, there were laws in place that limited how much a consumer could be charged for a loan. These included mortgages, car loans, and of course, credit cards. This very law that was created to establish protections for the consumer has become one of the culprits as to why we see APRs as high as we do today. In today's video, we will take a look back in time and go over a few laws so that we have a really good base and understanding of what shaped the credit interest rates that we see today. Before we get into that, if you do like this type of content and find the information helpful, please drop a like for the YouTube algorithm and subscribe to the channel. 94% of you who are watching aren't subscribed, so help me to turn that number around. The first piece of legislation that we need to be familiar with today is the Usury law. The Usury law is a piece of legislation that governs the amount of interest that can be charged on a loan. This law was put in place to specifically prevent exorbitantly or unconscionably high rates on loans by mandating the maximum amount of interest that could be charged. The basis of this law goes all the way back to 1545 in England, where the term usury was redefined. Usury is the practice of charging illegal interest rates for the lending of money. In 1545, England fixed illegal maximum interest rates, and any interest in excess of the maximum was determined to be usury. This legal maximum set a precedent on setting a maximum interest rate that was followed by Western nations such as the United States. This usury law is the very reason why some banks were losing money with their credit card products, because they weren't able to charge enough interest to churn a profit. At this point, you may be thinking, how is it possible to not make a profit when the consumer has to pay interest on the funds they've borrowed? Well, I'm glad you asked. For this answer, we'll have to venture back to 1980s, and no, venture back is not a new credit card by Capital One. However, Capital One, if you're watching and you're thinking of a new product, I just came up with an amazing name for you all. You're welcome. During the early 1980s, the United States, along with the majority of the rest of the world, found itself in a very intense economic recession. A major event attributing to this very severe recession was the 1979 energy crisis, which is said to be caused by the Iranian Revolution, which disrupted the global supply of oil, resulting in a sharp increase in oil prices between 1979 and 1980. Inflation was already high, but the increase in oil prices pushed inflation to new double-digit highs in many countries, including our own. Now, inflation is a theme that we are unfortunately becoming extremely familiar with once again, as well as the rising cost of oil. These major recession contributors led the Federal Reserve to tighten its monetary policies by increasing interest rates in order to control the uncontrollable level of inflation. Notably, in 1979, the Federal Reserve raised the discount rate that it charged its member banks from from 9.5% to 12% in an effort to reduce inflation. With the rising interest rates and rising unemployment rates, banks found it difficult to issue new mortgages or loans of any kind due to the protections that the usury law offered consumers. The usury limit depended upon which state the bank was chartered in. As interest rates continued to rise, this also meant that issuing loans became less and less profitable for banks because they could not raise interest rates higher than the rates outlined in their state's usury law. As you can imagine, this became a major problem for banks. By December of 1980, the Fed funds rate and prime rate had risen to 20% with mortgage rates at approximately 15%. This led to much higher costs for banks because banks were essentially paying more in interest on deposits than they were being paid on interest for loans. The usury laws prohibited the banks from charging more in interest, so of course this meant that every new loan was a guaranteed loss for the bank. This in turn dissuaded banks from issuing new loans. One of the banks impacted most by this was Citibank. In 1980, Citibank was and still is one of the nation's top credit card issuers. The problem with inflation, the rising Federal Reserve interest rate, and New York's usury law led Citibank into perilous times. With New York's law limiting interest rates to 12% and with the cost of money rising to 20%, it is pretty clear why Citibank was in real financial danger. So much so that Citibank was losing approximately $100,000 per day. If that figure isn't staggering enough when adjusted for inflation to be on par with the dollar value today, this equates to approximately $350,000 per day. Absolutely insane. To make matters worse, Citibank had already lost $1 billion with their credit card business, and it was clear that the bank would receive no relief from the New York legislature on its usury law. Now let's take a look at what happened in South Dakota. It became apparent that to get any new funds into the state's economy, something had to be done. There had to be a fundamental change on how interest rates were regulated in order to allow for the flexibility needed for banks to once again be able to make a profit from lending money. This was absolutely necessary to help small businesses and the agricultural sector to be able to secure new needed loans. The year was 1979, and unlike the New York legislature, South Dakota's legislature was willing to enact a change to its usury law. The Legislative Committee of the South Dakota Bankers Association met toward the end of 1979 to discuss its priorities for the 1980 legislation session. The hot ticket item at the forefront was the usury limit. The usury limit was previously raised from 10% to 12% in the 1979 session. However, with interest rates on the rise, another adjustment was needed. Needless to say, the South Dakota's Bankers Association passed a motion that would exempt regulated lenders from the state's usury limits. This exemption to the usury bill made its way into the 1980 state legislature on the first legislative day of the new year and was signed into state law after passing both the House and the Senate. This new law came at an opportune time for Citibank, but there is one more key piece to this story that I'd like to share with you all. Prior to the usury law change in South Dakota, the Supreme Court made a decision in the previous year that enables Citibank with the ability to make a very strategic decision. Marquette Bank, chartered in Minnesota, found itself losing business to an out-of-state competitor, which was First National Bank of Omaha. And of course, we know that any corporation with money will do what they feel is best to protect their money and business. The First National Bank of Omaha had an advantage over the Marquette Bank. Since it was chartered in Nebraska, it was subject to the usury limit set in Nebraska, which was 18%. The Marquette Bank had to abide by Minnesota's usury limit of 12%. For Marquette, in order to issue credit cards and keep it profitable for them, the bank had to charge an annual fee. And we all know how the vast majority of credit card holders today feel about annual fees. The First National Bank of Omaha didn't have to charge an annual fee because they were able to charge 18% in interest. So they cleverly marketed their credit card as such. Sneaky, sneaky. So in order to settle the differences between these two banks, the Marquette Bank looked to the Supreme Court to make a decision. And they probably thought that they had a case, but it turns out they didn't. The Supreme Court's decision in this case didn't benefit Marquette Bank at all. In fact, Justice Marshall stated, "I really feel Market Bank would have done better to take their case to an advertising agency." Yikes, that had to stay. Needless to say, the ruling was in favor for First National Bank of Omaha, and the court determined that under the National Bank Act, the laws of the card issuer's state of incorporation determined the maximum rate, not the laws of the state where the cardholder, i.e. their customers, live. This decision set off a light bulb in the heads of the Citibank executives. If New York's legislation wasn't willing to move on the usury limits, then the next best decision would be to move their operations to another state and call that new state their home. Of course, this was much easier said than done because there were even more laws to navigate that we are going to cover in today's video. Citibank executives began to seriously look at 5 states. Each state had no usury law, or the limit set by the state's usury law was high enough for them to become profitable. These states included Nevada, Hawaii, Rhode Island, Missouri, and South Dakota. South Dakota ultimately became the top contender on the list, and in 1981, Citibank moved its operations to South Dakota after doing all of the necessary lobbying they needed to do to make this successful for both Citibank and South Dakota. This set off somewhat of a chain reaction because Delaware copies South Dakota's law to be able to position itself to dominate the market share in the East. This change was so significant that it made it possible for the first time in the history of the US for banks to charge whichever interest rate they wanted on credit cards because there was a plausible and strategic way to circumvent the usury laws in states where they do business with their customers. Due to those key changes, credit cards have become the most profitable sector for banks. The most profitable credit card issuers of 2021 were American Express, Bank of America, Capital One, Citigroup, Discover Financial, JP Morgan Chase, Synchrony Financial, US Bancorp, and Wells Fargo. Together, they earned a total of $60.22 billion in pre-tax net income in 2021 versus approximately $24.3 billion in pre-tax net income in 2020. Now, of course, in 2020, we had the illness pandemic, but this gave rise to credit card issuers releasing new products such as the Chase Freedom Flex, Wells Fargo Active Cash, Capital One Venture X, and more. Not only did we see new credit card offerings, but we also saw strategic changes or revamps of existing credit card products, and I would argue that the Amex Platinum stands out here. To put the cherry on top, we saw historically high sign-up bonuses offered, and still to this day, there are historically high sign-up bonuses being offered. All of this was done to shore up and protect the extremely valuable credit card sector. The credit card business is serious business and is clearly a huge moneymaker for banks. And the dirty truth is that it's through the easing of state legislation, through those who were elected to office by the people, that paved the way for the extremely high interest rates that we see today. And this has grown the credit card sector to produce revenue of over $170 billion. With that said, we went over quite a bit of information today, and I know that today's video is completely different than any of my previous videos, but I found this information so fascinating that I wanted to bring this to you all. Now, next up in this series of videos will be understanding APR and how it is used to calculate the interest charges accrued on rolling balances on your credit accounts. If you are still watching, you won't want to miss that video, so go ahead and make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss when it is uploaded. If you haven't hit that like button yet, please be sure to show some love. And one thing we do around here is give everyone a high five at the end of the video as my thank you for watching all the way to the end. So come and get your high five.